I stared at my sister's message for what felt like an eternity, my coffee going cold in my hand as the words rearranged themselves in my mind, trying to make sense that wouldn't come. We live-streamed it last night. 7 words that confirmed what I'd been trying not to suspect for the past 48 hours, that the engagement party I'd funded, the event I'd spent 3 months coordinating and $23,000 paying for, had happened without me. Not postponed, not rescheduled, not a miscommunication about dates. They'd held it, celebrated it, broadcast it to hundreds of people online, and I'd watched it scroll past on my social media feed thinking it was some kind of pre-party promotion, never imagining it was the actual event. My name was on every contract, my credit card had paid every deposit, and somehow I'd been edited out of the celebration like a background extra deemed unnecessary for the final cut. I typed back with shaking hands, "What do you mean last night? The party is Saturday." Her response came fast. "Change of plans. Didn't think you'd mind since you said you might not make it anyway." Except I'd never said that. I'd said I might be late because of a work meeting, might miss the first hour, not that I wouldn't come at all. But apparently that ambiguity had been enough license to exclude me entirely. And now I was sitting in my apartment, holding proof of payment for an event I'd been uninvited from, feeling something cold and calculating settle in my chest where hurt should have been. My name is Morgan, and I've always been the practical sibling, the one who solved problems instead of creating them, the responsible older sister who kept things running smoothly while everyone else got to be spontaneous and creative and messy. My younger sister Hazel had been the opposite since birth, chaotic, charming, the kind of person who could talk her way into or out of anything with a smile and a story. Our parents had always treated this as complementary, like we were 2 halves of a functional whole, never acknowledging that one half was doing significantly more work than the other. When Hazel had gotten engaged 6 months earlier to her boyfriend Marcus, a musician with more ambition than income, everyone had been thrilled. I'd been happy for her too, genuinely, even as I'd recognized the familiar pattern beginning to form. The engagement had happened at a beachside cafe in a small tourist town where Hazel and Marcus had gone for a weekend, and she'd called me from the parking lot immediately after, her voice high with excitement and champagne. "You have to help me plan the party," she'd said, not asked, and I'd heard myself agreeing before I'd fully processed the request. "Something intimate but memorable," she'd continued, already painting the vision. "Maybe 50 people, good food, live music, somewhere with atmosphere." I'd started taking mental notes, my brain already calculating costs and logistics, and that should have been my first warning that I was stepping into something that would consume more than I intended to give. The planning had started small. Hazel would send me inspiration photos at midnight, links to venues she'd found, ideas that seemed beautiful until you looked at the price tags. I'd research options, make calls during my lunch breaks, compare quotes from caterers and florists and photographers. Somewhere in those early weeks, it had become clear that Hazel and Marcus had champagne tastes on a beer budget, specifically, a budget that didn't actually exist. "We'll pay you back," Hazel had promised when I gently raised concerns about costs. "Once we get wedding gifts, once Marcus's band gets that festival booking, we'll make it right." I'd heard variations of this promise my entire adult life, and I'd learned it meant nothing, but I'd also learned that pointing this out made me the villain of the family story. My parents had been enthusiastic but vague about their own contribution. "We'll help where we can," my mother had said, which I'd correctly interpreted as moral support rather than financial. My father had offered to handle the bar, which had sounded helpful until I'd realized he meant buying a case of mid-range wine and calling it good. Meanwhile, the event Hazel was envisioning required professional bartenders, signature cocktails, and top-shelf liquor. The gap between expectation and reality had yawned wider with each planning session, and I'd found myself bridging it, one credit card charge at a time. I'd tried to set boundaries. After the first $5,000, I'd sat Hazel down and explained that I couldn't fund the entire party, that she needed to scale back or find other sources of money. She'd cried, not manipulative tears but genuine disappointment, and talked about how this was her one engagement, her chance to celebrate something beautiful before the stress of wedding planning began. "I thought you'd want to do this for me," she said, and I'd heard the unspoken accusation. A good sister would asterisk. So I'd compromised, agreed to cover the venue and catering if she'd handle decorations and entertainment. She'd agreed enthusiastically, and I'd felt relieved, like I'd successfully negotiated a workable arrangement. Except Hazel's idea of handling, something was finding the most expensive option, and then looking at me with wounded eyes when I'd suggested alternatives. The decorations became an installation by a local artist who charged gallery prices. The entertainment became a 4-piece jazz band with a minimum 4-hour booking. Each decision had come with a story about why this particular choice was essential, meaningful, the only thing that would make the event what it needed to be. And each time, I'd found myself opening my wallet, reasoning that I'd already invested so much that abandoning the project now would mean losing everything. The venue alone had been $8,000, a converted warehouse space with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river in Millbrook, the mid-sized city where Hazel and Marcus lived. It had required a 50% deposit to hold the date, with the balance due 2 weeks before the event. I'd paid the deposit in March, transferred the final payment in early September, and received confirmation that everything was set for the October party. The caterer had been another $6,000, the bar service $1,500, flowers $1,200, the photographer $2,000, and then there were the small costs that accumulated like interest, invitations, a cake, rentals for tables and chairs that the venue didn't provide. Valet parking that Hazel had insisted was necessary because street parking was tacky. By the time we'd reached late September, I'd spent $23,000, and I'd stopped counting because the number made me feel physically ill. I made decent money as a project manager for a tech company, but I wasn't wealthy, and this represented a significant chunk of my savings. Money I'd been setting aside for a down payment on a house, for travel, for the kind of financial security that let you sleep soundly at night. Now it was all tied up in an engagement party that wasn't even my celebration, and every time doubt had crept in, I'd reminded myself that family was supposed to support each other, that this was an investment in my relationship with my sister, that surely Hazel appreciated what I was doing even if she had a funny way of showing it. The first real warning sign had come 3 weeks before the scheduled party date. I'd been copied on an email from the venue coordinator, a routine check-in about final details, and I'd noticed something odd. The event name had been changed. Instead of Hazel and Marcus engagement celebration, it was now listed as Private Event Hayes Residence. I'd called Hazel immediately, confused. "Oh, we wanted something that sounded more exclusive," she'd explained breezily. "Hayes is Marcus's middle name." "Don't worry about it, it's just for marketing." That explanation had felt thin, but I'd been swamped at work, dealing with a product launch that was consuming 60-hour weeks, and I'd let it slide. The second warning sign had been the sudden radio silence. Hazel, who'd been texting me multiple times daily with updates and ideas and requests, had gone quiet. When I'd reached out to confirm final details, what time she wanted me to arrive, whether she needed help with setup, if there was anything else I could handle, her responses had been delayed and vague. "All under control," she'd texted back. "You just show up and enjoy." At the time, I'd been relieved. I'd interpreted her newfound independence as growth, a sign she was finally taking ownership of her event. Now, with her message glowing on my phone screen, I understood it had been something else entirely. The careful distancing that comes before betrayal. I'd been in a meeting on Thursday afternoon when my phone had started buzzing with notifications. Instagram, Facebook, friends tagging me in posts and stories. I'd glanced at them during a break, seen what looked like party photos, Hazel in a gorgeous emerald dress I'd never seen, Marcus in a sharp suit, dozens of people I recognized from her social circle. The location tag had said private event venue with no specific address, and the hashtag had been Hayes House Party. I'd felt a moment of confusion. Was this a different party? Some kind of pre-celebration? But then my boss had called me back into the conference room, and I'd shoved my phone in my pocket, making a mental note to ask Hazel about it later. Later had come at midnight, when I'd finally finished work and pulled up the posts properly. The timestamps showed they'd been going live throughout Thursday evening, cocktail hour at 7, toasts at 8, dancing at 9. This wasn't a pre-party. This was the party, my party, happening without me while I'd been I. in a conference room analyzing quarterly projections. I'd scrolled through hundreds of photos, seen the venue I'd paid for looking exactly as I'd imagined it, the flowers I'd selected arranged on tables I'd approved, the food I'd chosen beautifully plated and photographed by guests with better phones than the photographer I'd hired. I'd tried calling Hazel immediately. No answer. Marcus, no answer. My parents, both calls going straight to voicemail. I'd lain awake until 3 a.m, scrolling through the live stream recordings people had posted, watching my sister celebrate her engagement in the space my money had created, and trying to understand what I'd done to deserve this exclusion. By Friday morning, I'd been exhausted and hurt and running on pure adrenaline. I'd texted Hazel a simple question. Did the engagement party happen last night? And that's when she'd sent the message that confirmed everything. We live streamed it last night. Her follow-up had come quickly, clearly anticipating my reaction. Change of plans. Didn't think you'd mind since you said you might not make it anyway. I'd stared at those words, feeling them rearrange reality. I'd never said I might not make it. I'd said I might be late due to a work meeting that I'd been trying to reschedule for weeks precisely so I wouldn't miss the party. But in Hazel's retelling, that caveat had been transformed into permission to exclude me entirely. I'd typed and deleted a dozen responses, rage and hurt competing for expression, before finally sending. I funded that entire event, Hazel. I've spent $23K of my own money. You didn't think I'd want to know you changed the date. Her reply had taken longer this time. We were trying to avoid drama. You've been so stressed with work. We thought you'd actually be relieved not to have to deal with party logistics on top of everything else. The gaslighting was almost impressive in its completeness. She'd taken my financial generosity and translated it into burdensome obligation, my hard work into stress I needed relief from. And the unspoken implication hung heavy. I'd been excluded for my own good, and I should be grateful. I'd spent Friday morning calling people who'd been at the party, fishing for information without revealing how little I knew. My friend Simone, who'd grown up in our neighborhood and maintained ties with both me and Hazel, had been horrified when I'd explained. Morgan, I had no idea you weren't there, she'd said. I assumed you were running late or had to leave early. The whole night, Hazel kept thanking everyone for coming, saying how meaningful it was to celebrate with people who truly supported them. I thought, she'd stopped, realizing the implication. I thought that included you. Through these conversations, I'd pieced together what had actually happened. About 3 weeks earlier, Hazel and Marcus had decided to move the party up by 9 days, ostensibly because some of Marcus's relatives could only travel on that date. They'd contacted guests with the new information, framing it as a surprise change that added spontaneity to the celebration. They'd used social media DMs and private text chains, deliberately excluding me from the communication. And they'd instructed the vendors to proceed with the event under the Hayes Residence name, which had technically complied with contract terms while keeping me in the dark. It was sophisticated, I'd realized with growing anger. This wasn't a last-minute impulsive decision. This had been planned, coordinated, executed with the kind of attention to detail that Hazel supposedly lacked when it came to actually managing the party logistics. She'd put more energy into excluding me than she'd ever put into the planning I'd been handling. And the live stream component had been particularly calculated, broadcasting the event publicly while ensuring I wouldn't stumble across it in real time by using a hashtag I wouldn't be searching for and a location tag that didn't specify the venue I knew about. Friday afternoon, I'd started making calls to the vendors. First, the venue coordinator, a woman named Diana who'd been professional and responsive throughout our months of planning. Deanna, this is Morgan Chen, I'd said, keeping my voice steady. I need to confirm something about the Hayes event that took place Thursday night. There'd been a pause. Yes, that event went beautifully, she'd said carefully. Is there a problem? I'd explained that I was the one who'd paid all deposits and final balances, that my name was on the contract as the financial responsible party, and that the event had occurred without my knowledge or attendance. I'm concerned there may have been a breach of contract terms. Diana had been quiet for a long moment. Ms. Chen, we processed a request 3 weeks ago to change the event date. The request came from the email address listed as the secondary contact on your booking. I believe it was Hazel too. Arez, I'd confirmed that was my sister. We sent a confirmation email to both addresses on file, Diana had continued, and I'd interrupted. I never received that email. More silence, then typing sounds. I'm looking at our records now, Diana had said slowly. The confirmation was sent to both emails, but there's a note here that Ms. Torres specifically requested we address all communications to her from that point forward due to your work schedule. We thought. You thought I'd delegated communication to her, I'd finished. Which would make sense, except I'm the one who's been paying you, and any major changes should have been confirmed with the financial party. Diana had agreed, sounding uncomfortable now. You're absolutely right, and I apologize. That was an oversight on our part. If there's anything we can do to make this right. She trailed off, clearly uncertain what making it right would even look like. I'd thanked her, said I'd be in touch, and moved to the next call. The caterer, the florist, the bar service, the photographer, each conversation had revealed the same pattern. Around September 20th, they'd all received communications from Hazel requesting date and detailed changes, always framed as coming from me or with my authorization. Some had questioned it, sent confirmation emails that had apparently gone to an address I didn't recognize. Others had simply proceeded, trusting that the secondary contact had the authority she claimed. None of them had called me directly, which was frustrating but also understandable. They were busy small businesses, and as long as the contracted services were delivered and paid for, the internal family dynamics weren't their concern. By Friday evening, I'd assembled a complete picture. I'd been systematically excluded through a combination of changed dates, redirected communications, and social engineering. And it had all been done in a way that technically didn't breach most contract terms. The services had been provided as agreed, just on a different date that I hadn't been informed of. The only potential breach was the unauthorized change of primary contact, which might violate the terms depending on how the contracts were written, and the use of the event for commercial purposes, the live stream, without my consent as the funding party. I'd pulled out all my contracts and read them thoroughly for the first time since signing, looking for leverage. Most were standard boilerplate, but a few had interesting clauses. The venue contract specified that major changes required written approval from the financial guarantor, me. The photography contract included a clause about image usage rights that reverted to the paying client, also me, unless otherwise negotiated. And several contracts had provisions about what constituted a material breach and what remedies were available. I'd called Rita then, the lawyer who'd helped me with the family fraud case years ago. We'd maintained a friendship, and she'd become my go-to person for legal questions. Rita, I need advice on something, I'd said, and explained the situation. She'd listened without interrupting, asked a few clarifying questions, then given me her assessment. They probably haven't broken the law, but they've definitely breached ethical boundaries and possibly contract terms. You have options, but you need to decide what you actually want here. Revenge, your money back, consequences, all of the above. I'd thought about that question through a sleepless Friday night. What did I want? The money was already spent, even if I could somehow force Hazel and Marcus to repay me, which seemed legally and practically impossible. It would take years and destroy what remained of our family relationships. Revenge felt hollow, the kind of thing that would make me feel worse rather than better. But consequences, that felt right. Not punishment for the sake of hurting them, but accountability that forced everyone to see what had been done, and who I actually was beyond the role of reliable ATM machine. Saturday morning, I'd woken with a plan forming. The event had happened, the money was spent, but the contracts were still in my name. Those vendors had provided services I'd paid for, and according to the terms, I maintained certain rights, particularly regarding how the event was marketed and what happened to the materials produced. I'd started making calls again, this time with a different purpose. Deanna, I'd like to discuss the unused portion of my venue contract, I'd said when I'd reached the warehouse coordinator. According to the terms, I paid for exclusive use of the space from noon to midnight on the originally scheduled date, next Saturday. That's still available, correct? Diana had confirmed it was. I'd like to transfer my contract to a different organization, I'd continued. I want to donate the space to the Millbrook Community Services Foundation for their staff appreciation gala. There'd been surprise in Diana's voice, but also relief. That's incredibly generous, Ms. Chen. I'll need to verify with our events director, but I don't see why that would be a problem. I'd made similar calls to each vendor, explaining that I wanted to redirect the services I'd paid for to a charitable cause. The caterer could provide the meal for the foundation's gala. The florist could donate the arrangements. The bar service could staff the event. The photographer could document it. In each case, I'd been careful to note that I was the paying client, that these were my contracted services to direct as I saw fit, and that I was choosing to use them to support an organization that provided housing assistance, job training, and emergency services to low-income families in the area. The Millbrook Community Services Foundation had been surprised but thrilled when I'd called to explain what I was offering. Their development director, a woman named Patricia, had actually gasped when I'd outlined the full scope. A venue, catering, flowers, photography, all provided at no cost. "We've been planning our staff gala for months," she'd said, voice shaking slightly. "But our budget is so limited. We were going to do it in our conference room with grocery store sheet cake." This is transformative. I'd felt something warm unfold in my chest, the first positive emotion I'd experienced since seeing Hazel's message. The logistics had moved quickly. By Saturday afternoon, all vendors had confirmed they could provide services to the foundation, with most actually seeming relieved to be part of something clearly charitable rather than potentially fraudulent. Deanna had been particularly helpful, even offering to reduce some fees since the event was now for a nonprofit. "Between you and me," she'd said quietly, "I felt uncomfortable about how Thursday night went down. I'm glad to see you're turning it into something good." I'd spent Saturday evening helping Patricia coordinate details, translating all my planning work into a new context. The menu I'd agonized over for Hazel became a celebration for social workers and case managers and administrative staff who rarely got recognized for the hard, invisible work they did. The flowers I'd selected became centerpieces that Patricia planned to give to each staff member to take home. The photographer I'd hired would document people who spent their careers being invisible, creating portraits that honored their service. Everything I'd built for my sister's celebration was being transformed into something that actually mattered. Sunday morning, I'd crafted a single social media post, my first and only public comment on the situation. Sometimes resources find their way to where they're most needed. Grateful to redirect my engagement party funding to support at Millbrook Community Services and their incredible staff. Their work changes lives daily, and they deserve celebration. Thank you to all the vendors who made this pivot possible. I'd tagged each business, attached photos of their original work from Thursday, screenshots from the live stream, and added images of the new gala preparations. Then I'd posted it and closed the app, not wanting to watch the reaction in real time. The response had been immediate and overwhelming. Friends who'd been at Hazel's party started commenting, confused about the timeline. Simone had messaged me privately. "Wait, you paid for Thursday's party and weren't even there." Her outrage had been followed by dozens of others, people putting together the pieces from my deliberately vague post and their own observations from the event. The vendors had started sharing my post to their own accounts, positioning themselves as community partners willing to support charitable pivots. And the foundation had amplified everything, expressing gratitude and explaining how transformative this donation was for their staff. Hazel had called me Sunday afternoon, furious. "What are you doing?" she demanded, no greeting. "You're making us look terrible, like we stole from charity or something." I'd taken a breath, chosen my words carefully. "I'm not making you look like anything, Hazel. I'm simply redirecting resources I paid for toward a purpose I believe in. You had your party. You used the services I funded. This doesn't take that away from you." She'd sputtered, searching for an argument. "But people are talking, saying we excluded you, that we're ungrateful." "Are they wrong?" I'd interrupted quietly. The silence had been heavy. Finally, Marcus had gotten on the phone speaker mode I'd realized from the sound quality. "Morgan, we can talk about this like adults," he'd said, trying for reasonable. "We made a mistake with the timing, we should have communicated better, But this public call-out thing, redirecting our vendors, it's vindictive. I'd actually laughed, couldn't help it. Your vendors, I'd repeated. Marcus, I paid for everything, every single thing, Hoes are my vendors, my contracts, my money. You had a party using resources I provided without inviting me. I'm not taking anything from you. You already got what you wanted. I'm just making sure my investment does some good beyond funding a celebration I was excluded from. You were invited, Hazel had jumped back in. You just didn't come because you were too busy with work. The rewriting of history was breathtaking. Hazel, you changed the date without telling me and then lied about why, I'd said flatly. That's not me being too busy, that's you deliberately excluding me. And now you're upset that other people see the truth. That's not my problem to fix. I'd hung up before they could respond, feeling shaky but clear. My parents had called next, my mother's voice tight with stress. Morgan, honey, what's going on? Hazel is very upset and we're seeing things online that are concerning. I'd explained the situation methodically, the funding, the exclusion, the redirect to charity. My mother had made sympathetic sounds, but I'd heard the judgment underneath. Well, I'm sure Hazel didn't mean to hurt you, she'd said. And this public response seems a bit extreme. Couldn't you have worked this out privately? That had stung, the familiar pattern of minimizing what had been done to me while maximizing my response. Mom, there was nothing to work out privately, I'd replied. I wasn't going to fight with Hazel over a party that already happened. I just used my resources differently than planned. That's not extreme. That's my right as the person who paid for everything. My father had taken the phone. This is making the family look bad, Morgan. People are saying we don't support each other, that there's dysfunction. Is that really what you want out there? I'd felt something crystallize inside me, cold and hard. Dad, what's out there is the truth. Hazel and Marcus took my money and excluded me from the celebration. That's not my dysfunction, that's theirs. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen just to keep up appearances. He'd started to argue, but I'd interrupted. I'm not discussing this further. The redirect is done, the foundation is thrilled, and I feel good about where my money went. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe ask yourself why. The following week had been intense with family drama swirling in text chains and phone calls I'd mostly ignored. But it had also brought unexpected rewards. The foundation's gala had been scheduled for Friday evening, and Patricia had insisted I attend as a guest of honor. I'd been reluctant. This was supposed to be about the staff, not about me, but she'd been persuasive. You made this possible, she'd said, and it would mean a lot to our team to thank you in person. The gala had been beautiful in ways Hazel's party never could have been. Same venue, same flowers, similar food, but the energy had been completely different. These were people who spent their days doing hard, necessary work for minimal pay and recognition. Social workers who'd talked down suicidal clients at 3 a.m. Case managers who'd found housing for families sleeping in cars. Administrative staff who'd kept systems running through funding cuts and increased demand. They dressed up in clothes that were clearly their best but not expensive, had taken endless photos because this night was special and rare, and had thanked me over and over for a gift I'd originally intended for my sister's Instagram moment. I'd given a brief speech, carefully worded to avoid making it about my family situation. I believe resources should go where they'll make the most impact, I'd said. And watching you all celebrate tonight, knowing the work you do every day, I can't imagine a better use for this party than honoring your commitment to serving our community. The applause had been genuine, warm, and I'd felt tears I'd been holding back for days finally escape. This was what the money should have bought all along, not social media validation or family obligation, but real appreciation for people doing meaningful work. Patricia had pulled me aside later, handed me a folder. I wanted you to see what your donation made possible beyond tonight, she'd said. Inside were photos and stories from clients whose lives had been changed by foundation services, families now in stable housing, people who'd found jobs through their training programs, kids succeeding in school because their basic needs were met. Every dollar we don't spend on overhead is a dollar that goes directly to services, she'd explained. You didn't just give our staff a nice party. You freed up funds we would have spent on our gala to help more people. That's dozens of families getting assistance they desperately need. I'd held that folder, understanding for the first time the full scope of what I'd done. $23,000 had seemed like an extravagant waste when it funded a party that excluded me, but redirect. D toward actual good, it had multiplied. A staff celebration that boosted morale and retention, plus freed funding that would ripple out to help vulnerable community members. The math of impact was so much more favorable than the math of family obligation had ever been. The social media aftermath had continued through the following week. Several guests from Hazel's party had reached out privately to apologize for not realizing I'd been excluded, to express discomfort with how things had gone down. Some had even offered to contribute to the foundation as a way of acknowledging they'd benefited from my generosity without knowing the full context. The vendors had all posted about the gala, using it as an example of their community commitment, and several had mentioned they were implementing new policies about verifying authorization for major contract changes. Even the journalist at the local paper had picked up the story, framing it as a feel-good piece about unexpected charitable giving, though anyone reading between the lines could see the family drama underneath. Hazel and Marcus had tried damage control, posting their own statements about how the whole thing had been a miscommunication, and how they'd always planned to include Morgan in celebration eventually. But the timeline was public now, screenshots of the party happening without me, followed by my redirect to charity, followed by their defensive explanations. Most people could see through it, and the narrative had solidified. I'd funded a party I'd been excluded from, then turned my disappointment into something positive for the community. They'd looked petty in comparison, and no amount of explaining could change that. My parents had eventually stopped calling, settling into cold distance that felt familiar from other times I'd refused to smooth over family dysfunction. I'd heard through relatives that they were disappointed in how I'd handled things, that they felt I'd weaponized charity to embarrass your sister. That framing had been revealing. They couldn't deny what Hazel had done, so they'd focused on criticizing my response, making my ethical choice seem like an attack. It had hurt less than I'd expected, maybe because I'd been preparing for years for the moment when I'd finally set boundaries they couldn't forgive. Vivian, oddly, had been unexpectedly supportive. We'd met for coffee about a month after the gala, and she'd been direct in a way I'd appreciated. "What Hazel did was wrong," she'd said simply. "Taking your money and excluding you, that's indefensible. I'm not going to tell you that you overreacted because you didn't. You responded proportionally and turned it into something good. That took real strength." Coming from someone who understood family manipulation, whose own recovery depended on recognizing and rejecting enabling patterns, her words had meant more than she'd probably realized. The months that followed had brought unexpected opportunities. Patricia had asked me to join the foundation's board of directors, wanting my project management skills and my obvious commitment to their mission. I'd accepted, finding real satisfaction in helping strategize programs and fundraising rather than just throwing money at problems. I'd also started speaking at community groups about charitable giving, about how personal disappointment could be channeled into purposeful action, about making sure your resources aligned with your values. Hazel and I had barely spoken since the redirect. She'd sent a few text messages, oscillating between defensive explanations and tentative olive branches, but I'd kept my responses brief and neutral. I wasn't interested in rehashing what had happened or in pretending we were fine when we clearly weren't. Maybe someday we'd rebuild some kind of relationship, but it would have to be on terms that respected my boundaries and acknowledged what she'd done. Until then, cordial distance felt healthier than forced connection. Marcus had actually reached out separately, about 6 months after the gala. "I wanted to apologize," he'd written in an email. "Not because I'm hoping you'll forgive us or give us money or anything like that, just because I've had time to think about what happened, and I can see now how wrong it was. Hazel and I got caught up in wanting the perfect party, and we convinced ourselves that because you were stressed about work, you wouldn't mind missing it. But that was just us rationalizing our own selfishness. You deserved better from us, especially after everything you did to make that party possible." The apology had been more thoughtful than I'd expected, and I'd appreciated it even if it didn't change the past. I'd responded briefly, acknowledging his message and thanking him for taking accountability. I hope you and Hazel have learned something about communication and reciprocity, I'd written. Those are going to be important skills for marriage. He'd replied with a simple, yes, we have, thank you. We hadn't communicated since, but that small exchange had provided a sense of closure I hadn't known I'd needed. The foundation had continued to thrive, and I'd become increasingly involved in their work. I'd helped them redesign their fundraising strategy, bringing in corporate sponsors and individual donors who could sustain their programs long-term. I'd also established a small fund in my name, not for recognition, but to ensure there was dedicated money for staff development and appreciation. Your team works incredibly hard, I'd told Patricia. They should know they're valued, not just once at an annual gala, but consistently. She'd teared up at that, explaining how high burnout was in social services, how small gestures of appreciation could be the difference between someone staying or leaving. I'd also become more intentional about my own boundaries with family. I'd stopped automatically saying yes to requests for money or time, stopped absorbing the unspoken expectation that I'd always be the one to solve problems or smooth over conflict. When my mother had called asking if I'd contribute to Hazel's wedding fund, I'd said no clearly and without apology. I've already given Hazel $23,000, I'd said. She chose how that money was used, and I've chosen not to contribute further. My mother had been shocked, unused to hearing me decline without explanation or justification. But I'd held firm, understanding that my no was complete without needing to defend it. A year after the engagement party that wasn't mine, I'd been invited to speak at a conference on nonprofit innovation. They'd asked me to talk about unexpected charitable giving, about the story of redirecting personal resources toward community good. I'd agreed, carefully crafting a presentation that honored the foundation's work while acknowledging the personal circumstances that had led to my involvement. Sometimes our plans don't work out the way we expected, I'd said to a room full of nonprofit leaders and philanthropists. And in those moments, we have a choice. We can focus on what we lost, or we can redirect toward what matters. I chose redirect, and it changed not just how I give, but who I am as a person. The questions afterward had been insightful. Someone had asked how I'd overcome the emotional hurt to make such a generous gesture. I didn't overcome it, I'd answered honestly. I transformed it. The hurt was still there, but I used it as fuel for action rather than letting it turn into bitterness. That's not the same as overcoming, it's more like alchemy, turning something painful into something purposeful. Another person had asked if I regretted not fighting to get my money back. Never, I'd said firmly. Fighting would have cost more in emotional energy than the money was worth. And this way, my money did real good instead of just circulating through a family dispute. Hazel had gotten married that following summer, a small ceremony that I'd been invited to but hadn't attended. She'd called to extend the invitation personally, her voice careful. I know things have been difficult between us, she'd said, but you're still my sister and I'd like you there. I'd thanked her for the invitation and explained that I wasn't ready to celebrate her relationship when we hadn't addressed the hurt between us. Maybe someday, I'd said, but not yet. She'd accepted that more gracefully than I'd expected, and I'd sent a card with a modest gift, nothing extravagant, just acknowledgement. My parents had been hurt by my absence, interpreting it as ongoing punishment rather than self-protection. But I'd become comfortable with their misinterpretation, understanding that I couldn't control their narrative any more than I could control what had happened at the engagement party. What I could control was my own presence, my own boundaries, my own choices about what family obligations I'd honor and which I'd decline. That discernment felt like power reclaimed rather than family abandoned. 2 years post-redirect, I'd received an unexpected email from Marcus. Subject line, update. Inside was a brief message. You might be interested to know that Hazel and I completed a financial literacy course and started seeing a couples therapist about communication. The redirect you did and the public response to it forced us to look at patterns we'd been avoiding. We weren't honest with each other about money, about expectations, about a lot of things. Working on that now. Thank you for not enabling us. Attached was a screenshot of a small donation to the foundation, $50 from Hazel and Marcus Hayes. It wasn't much, and it certainly wasn't restitution, but it was something, acknowledgement, maybe, or the beginning of accountability. I'd responded briefly, "Glad to hear you're doing the work, that's what matters." And I'd meant it. I didn't need Hazel and Marcus to grovel or to repay me or Ven to have a close relationship with me. But knowing they'd taken the situation as a catalyst for growth rather than just a source of embarrassment, that felt like an unexpected gift. Not redemption, but evidence that consequences could lead to insight if people were willing to do the work. The foundation's impact had continued to grow, and I'd become something of an accidental advocate for community services. I'd helped them secure a major grant, testified before city council about housing needs, written op-eds about the importance of supporting social services infrastructure. None of this had been planned when I'd made that first call to Patricia, redirecting services from Hazel's party. But it had grown organically from my decision to channel hurt into purpose, to refuse to let betrayal define me. I'd also started a blog, writing about boundaries and family dynamics, and the complicated work of being both hurt and functional. I'd shared parts of my story, redacted for privacy, but recognizable to anyone who knew me, and the response had been overwhelming. Hundreds of people had commented or emailed, sharing their own stories of family financial abuse, of being taken advantage of by siblings or parents, of struggling to set boundaries without being labeled the villain. We'd created a small online community, people supporting each other through the messy work of loving family while protecting yourself from them. One woman had written, "I paid for my brother's rehab 3 times, and he's never stayed sober. Your story about redirecting to charity instead of enabling made me realize I could use that money to support recovery programs instead of funding his relapses." It felt like permission to say enough. Her message had encapsulated what I'd been trying to articulate, that you could be generous and have boundaries, that caring about someone didn't mean funding their dysfunction, that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was let people face consequences. 3 years after the engagement party, I'd been invited to a foundation fundraising gala, not the staff appreciation one I'd funded, but their major annual event for donors and community leaders. Patricia had asked me to say a few words about why I supported their mission. I'd stood at the podium, looking out at a room full of people who'd committed time and resources to community good, and I'd felt genuine pride in being part of something meaningful. 3 years ago, I made a decision that felt impulsive, but turned out to be transformative, I'd said. I redirected resources I'd intended for a private celebration towards supporting this organization's staff. I did it because I was hurt, because I needed my money to mean something, because I wanted to prove that generosity wasn't wasted even when it wasn't appreciated. I'd paused, seeing heads nodding in understanding. What I didn't expect was how much that decision would change me. Supporting this foundation taught me that real impact comes from sustained commitment, not one-time gestures. That the most vulnerable members of our community don't need charity. They need systems that actually work for them. And that the best way to heal from personal hurt is to channel that energy into collective good. The applause had been warm, and afterward dozens of people had approached me with their own stories of redirecting pain into purpose. A man whose inheritance had been stolen by family had started a scholarship fund. A woman whose wedding had been sabotaged had donated her dress and decorations to a nonprofit serving foster youth. A couple whose vacation savings had been drained by a asterisk scam had created a fund for financial fraud victims. The common thread was transformation, refusing to let betrayal make us bitter, choosing instead to let it make us purposeful. Hazel had shown up at that gala, surprisingly. I'd spotted her near the back of the room during my speech, and afterward she'd approached me cautiously. "That was really beautiful," she'd said, her voice small. "What you've built here, what you've done with..." She'd stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "With what should have been my party." I'd nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement. "It became something better," I'd said simply. We'd stood there awkwardly for a moment, years of hurt and distance between us before she'd continued. "I'm pregnant, due in November." The announcement had caught me off guard, and I'd felt a complicated mix of emotions: happiness for her, grief for our fractured relationship, uncertainty about what role I'd play in this new chapter. "Congratulations," I'd said, meaning it. "How are you feeling?" We talked for a few minutes about morning sickness and doctor's appointments and the overwhelming nature of impending parenthood, carefully avoiding the larger issues between us. Before she'd left, she'd touched my arm lightly. "I want my child to know their aunt," she'd said. "I know I don't deserve that. After what I did, but I'm asking anyway. Not now, maybe, but eventually." I'd thought about it, really thought about it. "Eventually," I'd agreed. "When you're ready to have the hard conversations about what happened and why, not just apologies, but real accountability, then we can talk about what a relationship might look like." She'd nodded, tears in her eyes, and walked away. I'd watched her go, feeling the weight of possibility and caution in equal measure. Maybe we'd rebuild something, or maybe this was as close as we'd get. Either way, I'd set my terms clearly, and that felt like its own kind of victory. My parents had softened slightly over the years, particularly once grandchildren were on the horizon. My mother had reached out more frequently, and our conversations had slowly moved from strained pleasantries to something approaching genuine connection. She'd admitted, finally, that she'd been wrong to pressure me about the wedding fund, that she'd been prioritizing Hazel's feelings over mine for too long. "I thought you were stronger, that you didn't need the same support," she'd explained. "I can see now that was unfair. Needing less doesn't mean deserving less." It wasn't a complete reckoning with years of favoritism, but it was acknowledgement, and I'd learned to accept incremental progress over perfect resolution. My father had remained more distant, though we'd reached a workable peace. We'd have dinner occasionally, talk about surface things, my work, his retirement hobbies, current events. We didn't discuss Hazel or the engagement party or the years of dysfunction that had preceded it. Maybe someday we would, but maybe not, and I'd made peace with that uncertainty. Some relationships couldn't be fully repaired, and accepting their limitations was healthier than forcing depth that didn't exist. 4 years after the redirect, I'd received a letter from Patricia announcing her retirement. She'd led the foundation for 20 years, and she was ready to pass the torch. The board had met to discuss succession planning, and to my surprise, they'd asked me to consider applying for the executive director position. "You've been instrumental in our growth," Patricia had written, "and you understand both the operational and heart sides of this work. You'd be remarkable in this role." I'd been shocked, honored, and terrified. Taking the position would mean leaving my tech job, stepping fully into nonprofit work, committing to community service as my career rather than my volunteer work. I'd spent weeks deliberating, talking to friends and mentors and my therapist about such a major life change. Owen had been supportive but practical. "You've been half checked out of your tech job for over a year," he'd pointed out. "Every time you talk about the foundation, you light up. This isn't really a question of what you want, it's a question of whether you're brave enough to choose it." He'd been right, as usual. I'd submitted my application, gone through a rigorous interview process, and been offered the position. I'd accepted with a sense of rightness I'd never felt in corporate work. Leading the foundation had been challenging and rewarding in ways I hadn't anticipated. Budget constraints, staffing issues, the constant pressure of knowing that lives literally depended on the work we did. It was heavier than project management had ever been. But it was also meaningful in a way that spreadsheets and product launches had never been. I was helping create systems that caught people when they fell, that gave them tools to rebuild, that recognized their dignity even in their worst moments. Every success story, every family stabilized, every crisis averted, it all felt connected to that original decision to redirect hurt into purpose. Hazel had given birth to a daughter, Clara, and had cautiously started inviting me into their lives. I'd met the baby when she was 2 months old, held her tiny weight in my arms, and felt a fierce protective love that surprised me. Whatever was broken between me and Hazel, this child deserved an aunt who showed up, who provided stability, who modeled healthy boundaries. I'd started visiting monthly, bringing small gifts, helping with the overwhelming adjustments of new parenthood. Hazel and I had eventually had the hard conversation I'd required, a 3-hour discussion where she'd taken real accountability for the engagement party, for years of taking advantage, for assuming my generosity was infinite and unconditional. "I thought you'd always be there," she'd admitted, crying. "And I took that for granted. I convinced myself you didn't need thanks or recognition because you were just naturally helpful, like it wasn't costing you anything. But I can see now that every time I took without giving back, I was making a choice about whose needs mattered more." She'd looked at me, mascara running, exhausted from sleepless nights with a newborn. I'm sorry. Really, truly sorry. Not because I want something from you now, but because I finally understand what I took from you and how wrong that was. Her apology had cracked something open in me, the protective shell I'd built to survive her betrayal. Thank you, I'd said quietly. That means more than you know. We'd cried together, mourned the years of distance, and cautiously begun rebuilding. It wasn't quick or easy or complete, but it was real, and real was what I'd needed all along. 5 years post-redirect, the foundation had doubled its impact, serving twice as many families with more comprehensive programs. We'd expanded from emergency assistance into preventive services, financial literacy, job training, mental health support, recognizing that true stability required more than just crisis intervention. I'd been interviewed by national media about our model, invited to speak at conferences about innovative nonprofit leadership, recognized by the City Council for community impact. None of that had been the goal when I'd made that first angry phone call to Diana, but it had become the legacy of that decision. I'd also written a book, expanding the blog posts into a full memoir about family boundaries, financial abuse, and choosing purpose over bitterness. The writing process had been cathartic and painful, forcing me to revisit details I'd tried to forget, to examine my own role in enabling dysfunction before I'd finally set limits. The book had sold modestly, but meaningfully, reaching people who needed permission to protect themselves from family harm. The reviews that meant the most weren't from critics, but from readers who wrote to say, "You told my story," or "You gave me the courage to say no." Hazel had read the book and called me afterward, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm in there," she'd said. "I know you changed names and details, but I recognize myself, and seeing it through your eyes, understanding how much I hurt you." She'd paused, gathering herself. "I'm so sorry, Morgan. Reading that made me realize I've only apologized for the engagement party. But you cataloged years of me taking advantage, and I never acknowledged most of it. I'm sorry for all of it. For being a taker, for assuming your generosity was endless, for never wondering what it cost you." We talked for hours that night, the most honest conversation we'd ever had. She'd shared her own therapy insights about why she'd become so entitled, patterns from our parents, her own insecurities about never being as capable as I was. I'd shared my resentment and exhaustion, the way I'd felt invisible and used, my grief over the sister relationship we could have had if things had been different. It wasn't a magical healing moment. We didn't emerge as best friends or erase the past. But we emerged with understanding, with realistic expectations, with a foundation for something healthier going forward. My parents had also read the book, though neither discussed it with me directly. I'd heard through Hazel that it had prompted difficult conversations between them, that they were in couples therapy working through their own patterns around favoritism and emotional manipulation. My mother had sent a brief text. "I read your book. You were right about more than I wanted to admit. I'm sorry for my part in your hurt, working on being better." It was spare, inadequate, but also honest in a way she'd never been before. I'd taken it as the offering it was, not expecting more, not requiring perfection. 6 years after the engagement party that wasn't mine, I'd stood at another gala, this one celebrating the Foundation's 25th anniversary and raising record funds for program expansion. Clara, now 2 years old, had been there with Hazel and Marcus, wearing a tiny dress and running between tables with the fearless joy of toddlerhood. My parents had come, sitting with Vivian and her family, looking older but also more at peace. Owen had been beside me, my partner in life and increasingly in work, as he'd taken on volunteer coordination for the foundation. Patricia had been there too, retired but still connected, and she'd pulled me aside during the cocktail hour. "You know what I'm most proud of?" she'd asked. I'd waited, curious. "Not the programs we've built or the lives we've changed, though those matter enormously. I'm most proud that we took something painful and personal, your hurt over that party, and transformed it into systemic good. That's real alchemy. That's how we heal ourselves and our communities simultaneously." Her words had stayed with me through the evening, through my speech thanking donors and staff, through the silent auction and dancing, and all the elements of a successful fundraiser. This had started with betrayal, with my sister's selfishness and my family's dysfunction and my own hurt pride. But it had become something so much larger, a career shift, a mission realized, a way of being in the world that prioritized impact over image. The 23T. House and dollars I'd spent had multiplied countless times over in services provided, lives stabilized, dignity restored. As I'd driven home that night, Owen dozing in the passenger seat, I'd thought about the journey from that shocking text message to this moment. The anger I'd felt had been real and justified, but it hadn't consumed me because I'd channeled it into action. The hurt had been deep and lasting, but it hadn't destroyed me because I'd refused to let it define me. And the family fractures had been painful, but they'd forced growth that never would have happened if I'd just swallowed my feelings and moved on. Would I go back and change it if I could? Would I fund the party differently, set boundaries earlier, avoid the whole painful situation? I'd asked myself that question many times over the years, and the answer was always complicated. I wouldn't choose to be hurt, to be betrayed, to lose years of closeness with my family. But I also wouldn't be who I was now without having walked through that fire. The foundation work, the boundary setting, the self-knowledge, all of it had been forged in the heat of that betrayal. I was stronger, clearer, more purposeful because of what happened, and I couldn't wish that away even if I wanted to undo the pain that created it. 7 years after the redirect, Hazel had asked if I'd be Clara's godmother. Not in a religious way, she'd clarified, but in a please be present in her life and help guide her way. I want her to know you, to learn from you, to see what healthy boundaries look like. I'd been moved by the request, understanding what it represented, Hazel's recognition of my value, her desire for Clara to have what our relationship had lacked. I'd agreed, understanding I was committing to long-term presence in my niece's life, modeling for her what I wished someone had modeled for me. The godmother ceremony had been small and personal, held in Hazel's backyard with close family and friends. Clara had worn a white dress and laughed as she'd played with bubbles, oblivious to the significance adults were assigning to the moment. I'd made promises to be present, to tell her truth, to support her growth into whoever she was meant to become. And I'd looked at Hazel, saw tears streaming down her face, and understood she was grieving too. For the sister I could have been to her if she hadn't pushed me away, for the relationship we were rebuilding but could never fully restore. The foundation continued its work, touching thousands of lives annually, becoming a model other cities studied and replicated. I'd hired incredibly talented staff, built a strong board, created systems that would outlast my individual leadership. The work had become bigger than my personal story, bigger than the engagement party redirect, bigger than any one person's contribution. That felt right, transformation that started from personal pain but grew into collective healing. Now, standing in my office at the foundation, looking at photos on the wall, staff celebrations, program milestones, clients who'd rebuilt their lives, I understood that the story that began with Hazel's text message had no neat ending. Family relationships remained complicated, healing was ongoing, and consequences continued to ripple outward in ways I couldn't fully track. But the central truth remained clear. When I'd been faced with betrayal and hurt, I'd chosen purpose over bitterness, action over paralysis, boundaries over enabling. That choice had changed everything, not because it fixed what was broken, but because it redirected broken pieces into something functional and good. I'd learned that justice didn't always look like restitution or revenge. Sometimes it looked like taking your power back, using your resources in ways that aligned with your values, refusing to let other people's choices diminish your worth. The engagement party had happened without me, and that reality couldn't be changed. But what happened to the resources I'd provided, that I could control? And in controlling it, in redirecting toward genuine good, I discovered a kind of justice that satisfied in ways punishment never could have. The story of the midnight text, of Hazel's betrayal and my redirect, had become foundational to who I was, not as a wound I carried, but as a transformation I'd chosen. Every time I told it, in speeches or interviews or casual conversations, I ended the same way. We can't control what others do to us, but we can control what we do with the aftermath. We can let betrayal make us bitter, or we can use it as fuel for purpose. The choice is always ours, and that's where our real power lies.